When a family walks into a funeral home to arrange services, they are usually doing it within 48 hours of a death. They have never done it before. They don't know what anything costs. And the person walking them through the process is also the person selling them everything in the room. That arrangement, the grieving family, the unfamiliar process, the single provider with full information is the foundation of how funeral home pricing works. The 500% markups are real, but understanding why they exist requires looking at more than just greed. It requires looking at the economics of a business that almost no one thinks about until they suddenly have no choice. Start with the basic structure of the business. The average funeral home serves roughly 113 families per year. That is about 2 per week. On any given Tuesday, a funeral home is paying its staff, maintaining its facility, keeping its preparation room equipped, and its fleet of vehicles running, whether it has a call that week or not. Staff costs alone typically account for 40 to 50% of a funeral home's fixed expenses, covering licensed funeral directors, embalmers, and administrative staff. Those salaries don't pause between funerals. This is the central financial pressure of the business. The costs are largely fixed. The revenue is not. A funeral home cannot run a sale to bring in more customers. It cannot manufacture demand. It serves whoever calls, whenever they call, and it has to be staffed and ready every time. Industry budgeting practice accounts for this by calculating expenses against 90% of expected call volume, building in the assumption that there will be slow years and that the pricing per case needs to absorb them. That math pushes prices up, and it pushes them up most visibly on merchandise. Casket markups of 300 to 500% are standard in the industry. A casket that costs a funeral home $1,000 wholesale might sell for $4,000 to $5,000. Burial vaults, the outer burial containers required by most cemeteries, carry similar margins and are often presented as non-negotiable, even when they are not. This is not incidental. Merchandise, caskets, vaults, urns is where funeral homes have historically recovered the gap between what their services cost to provide and what families actually pay for them. Professional service fees, embalming, transportation, the use of the facility, these carry lower margins. According to data from the National Funeral Directors Association, the median cost of a funeral with viewing and burial now runs approximately $8,300. A standard funeral generates somewhere between $700 and $1,000 in net profit for the funeral home. The casket showroom is where that number gets built. There is also a psychological dimension to how merchandise is sold that the industry has understood for a long time. Families choosing a casket are almost never in a state to comparison shop. They are in a showroom surrounded by options arranged from least to most expensive, making a decision that feels like a reflection of how much they loved someone. Staff trained in what the industry calls compassionate upselling, steering families toward premium options without appearing to pressure them, can increase average revenue per case by 15 to 30%. The training exists. It is taught. The phrases used are not accidental. There is another revenue mechanism that operates well before the death itself: pre-need contracts, arrangements families make and pay for years or even decades in advance. Pre-need funeral contracts lock in services and merchandise at today's prices, and they are aggressively marketed by funeral homes. They represent both a genuine planning tool and a significant source of forward revenue for the death care industry. The pricing psychology involved is different. The customer has more time, more capacity to compare, but the margins on pre-need merchandise are not. This pricing structure did not emerge from nowhere. For most of the 20th century, there was no outside pressure on it at all. In 1963, a British journalist named Jessica Mitford published a book called The American Way of Death. She had spent months reading funeral trade publications and sitting in on arrangements, and what she documented was a system built around a customer who had no information, no time, and no realistic ability to walk away. The book got the attention of the Federal Trade Commission, which opened a formal investigation into funeral home practices in 1964. That investigation took 20 years to produce a rule. During those 2 decades, funeral homes could tell families that embalming was legally required. In nearly every state, it was not. They could bundle every service and product into a single package price with no obligation to break it apart. A family who wanted only a simple cremation could be quoted a price built around a traditional full-service funeral. None of this required deception in a legal sense. It simply required that no one on the outside was watching closely enough to require otherwise. The FTC funeral rule, which took effect in 1984, changed the informational landscape. It required funeral homes to provide a general price list, a GPL, to any family that walked in, along with itemized pricing and phone quotes, and it put an end to false embalming claims. What it did not change were the prices themselves. By the time the rule took effect, the pricing structures had been standard practice for decades, and the rule's own requirements, forcing families to consider each line item individually, created new decision points that funeral homes learned to use. A study published in 1990 found that average funeral spending had actually increased after itemized pricing was introduced. The industry has also consolidated significantly since Mitford wrote. Today, one company, Service Corporation International, operates over 1,500 funeral homes and cemeteries across North America under consumer brands, including Dignity Memorial, Neptune Society, and National Cremation Society. SCI alone represents roughly 15% of the U.S. funeral market. The National Funeral Directors Association, the industry's primary trade group, estimates there are around 19,000 funeral homes still operating in the country, but the trend runs toward consolidation. A locally owned funeral home and a Dignity Memorial location may look identical from the street. The pricing structures inside them are largely the same. One thing that has changed substantially is what families choose. When Mitford published her book, cremation was a minority practice in the United States. Today, according to the National Funeral Directors Association, cremation accounts for more than 63% of all dispositions. Direct cremation, a simple transfer with no viewing, no embalming, no ceremony at the funeral home, is the fastest growing segment of the market. It can cost as little as $700 to $1,500, a fraction of the traditional funeral price. The industry has adapted by developing cremation-specific merchandise and service packages that begin to rebuild the margins that a direct cremation eliminates. The markups that exist today are the product of several things operating together: a fixed cost business with unpredictable volume, a merchandise category with few natural price anchors, a customer who is almost always making the decision under duress, and a long period during which no external standard required any of it to be different. None of that makes the prices feel smaller, but it does explain why, when you sit down across from a funeral director 2 days after a death, the numbers on the general price list look the way they do. They weren't designed for that moment. They were designed around the certainty that you would be there.